Spring settled over South Carolina in 1841, like a fever no one could shake. The air pressed close and wet, heavy enough to taste, the kind of heat that made you believe the world itself could rot if left too long in the sun. The Combe River moved lazily through the low country, its surface black and still, mirroring the long arms of live oaks and the gray veils of Spanish moss that dripped from their branches. In the fields beyond, hundreds of enslaved men and women stood knee-deep in the rice paddies, their reflections trembling with every motion. From dawn to dusk they worked in the water, their labor feeding fortunes that were built from their suffering. Cypress Grove Plantation was not the grandest estate in Colleton County, but its owner Silas Rutledge liked to pretend it was. 800 acres of middling soil, 58 enslaved people, and a house that tried too hard to look like wealth. Silas was a man who wanted desperately to belong among the county's true elite, the families whose names opened doors, whose sons attended northern universities, whose daughters summered in Charleston. He had the hunger for power, but not the pedigree. He had money, but not the kind that came from generations. So he chased it, day after day, until the pursuit itself became his only prayer. He was a tall man, thin to the point of severity, with the hollow eyes of someone who mistook ambition for faith. He had married young to Elizabeth Yancey, for her family's respectability and her modest inheritance. She died a year later, giving birth to a daughter, Catherine, and Silas raised the child alone, though raised was hardly the word. He provided tutors and servants, dresses and meals, but no warmth. He was a man who understood property, not people. By the time Catherine reached 28, she had become the plantation's quiet shame. She weighed more than 260 pounds, her face pale and bloated from mercury tonics prescribed by doctors who called her condition female hysteria. Her hands trembled constantly. Her thoughts came in bursts, and every physician who failed her prescribed more laudanum, more mercury, more poison. The neighbors spoke of her with the practiced pity of those who love gossip more than compassion. Poor Silas, they said. Such a burden to have a mad daughter, such a tragedy that she'd once been so pretty. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know what Catherine had seen when she was 12 years old, the things she'd never been allowed to speak of again. They didn't know her madness was not illness but memory. Because deep beneath Cypress Grove, behind walls that smelled of blood and smoke, Catherine had seen her father and his friends gathered in ritual. And she had watched them kill. On April 7, 1841, Silas received a letter that made his blood run cold. It arrived by private courier, sealed with dark red wax, stamped with a symbol he recognized immediately, a scythe, crossed with a stalk of wheat, the mark of the Brethren of the Harvest. 13 men, a secret order of planters, judges, and ministers who met under the pretense of blessing the land, but whose ceremonies demanded blood to keep their fortunes alive. Silas had been one of them for 19 years. He'd seen things, done things that a man could not easily speak of again. But this letter wasn't about faith. It was about debt. He owed them $12,000, money lost in bad investments, gambling, and poor harvests. The sum was impossible to repay. Bankruptcy would mean ruin. Refusal would mean worse. The letter offered him another choice, one that would cost him not money but something dearer. He was to make a demonstration, an offering. His daughter Catherine, placed under the full authority of an enslaved man for 1 full year. Not as a caretaker, not as a nurse. As her master in all but law, it was to be announced publicly, before the county's most respected families. The humiliation would be absolute. A white woman made lesser than property. A father admitting that his daughter was unfit for her own life. But if Silas complied, His debt would be forgiven, his fortune restored, and his standing secured. He sat in his study until dawn, staring at the letter, weighing the ruin of his reputation against the ruin of his soul. And by sunrise he chose as he always had: power over love, reputation over humanity. He signed his name with a trembling hand. 3 days later, another message arrived. It contained a name: Ezekiel Cross, 33 years old. A carpenter and herbalist purchased from a Virginia plantation, his temperament quiet, obedient. But those words were lies, written by men who had no idea what moved behind Ezekiel's calm expression. Because Ezekiel had been looking for Silas Rutledge for 3 years. When the wagon carrying Ezekiel pulled up to the main house, the first thing Silas noticed were his eyes. Most enslaved people learned early to keep their gaze low, but not Ezekiel. He looked directly at Silas, steady, unreadable, unflinching. It unsettled the man immediately. He didn't know that Ezekiel carried with him a small cloth bundle tucked beneath his shirt, and inside it a worn scrap of paper bearing 3 names written in a child's hand: Sarah, Benjamin and Ruth, his wife, his son, his daughter, sold away by Silas Rutledge to prove his loyalty to the brethren, not for money, not for need, simply to demonstrate obedience. Sarah died of fever. Benjamin's leg was crushed in the field and turned septic. Ruth, only 6 years old, stopped eating and faded away. Silas had smiled when he signed the papers. Ezekiel never forgot that smile. He'd spent the years since moving south, plantation to plantation, listening for whispers of the brethren. And when he finally heard Silas's name, he made sure he was sold directly into the man's hands. The morning after he arrived, he met Catherine. Her room was a tomb of faded curtains and stale air. The smell of mercury hung thick and sour. She sat in a chair wrapped in a stained dressing gown, her dark hair tangled, her eyes dull but defiant. "I don't want another doctor," she muttered when he entered. "I'm not a doctor," Ezekiel said softly. "My name is Ezekiel. Your father sent me to help." She laughed then, sharp and bitter. "They all say that: help, treatment, medicine. They mean chains. They mean silence." Ezekiel crossed the room and opened the curtains. Light poured in like a revelation. Catherine hissed and covered her eyes, her skin pale as wax. "When did you last see the sun?" he asked. She didn't answer. "When did you last eat without a dose of laudanum?" Her voice trembled. "The medicine is necessary. The doctors say so." Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment and then said quietly, "What if the doctors are wrong?" She lowered her hands, blinking at him. "What did you say? What if they're not curing you? What if someone's keeping you sick, so you'll stay quiet?" For a long time she said nothing, and then she whispered, "You don't know what happens in this house, what they do below." "I know enough," he said, "and I know you're not mad." That was the moment something between them shifted. The first fragile thread of trust. Over the next weeks he began her treatment. He reduced her laudanum, replacing it with bitter herbal tinctures. Valerian root to calm her, milk thistle to clear the poison from her blood, chamomile to ease her pain. The process was agony. She shook and screamed and vomited for days, her body wringing itself clean of the toxins that had kept her docile for half her life. Ezekiel stayed beside her through it all, holding her hand when she clawed at the sheets, wiping sweat from her face, speaking quietly so she'd know she wasn't alone. When the fever broke, her hands were steadier, her eyes clearer. She began to walk again, down the hall and back, one slow step at a time. And when she could stand without swaying, she began to remember. She told Ezekiel what she'd seen as a child, the night she wandered down the back stairs following her father's voice. The secret door that led to the cellar, the chanting, the woman bound to a table, the men standing in a circle. She told him what they had done, what she had watched and how afterward her father told her it had been a dream. How he'd spent the next 16 years convincing her and everyone else that she was insane. In return, Ezekiel told her about his family. About Sarah, who sang while she worked, Benjamin, who could count faster than the overseer, Ruth, who loved wildflowers, and how Silas had destroyed them all. They made a promise that night. She would help him destroy the brethren, and he would help her remember who she truly was. When the announcement came, it was a spectacle. Silas invited 40 of the county's finest to dinner. There were oysters and roasted duck, rice and sweet potatoes, cakes that towered like monuments. And when the plates were cleared, Silas stood and raised his glass. He thanked his guests for coming, spoke of his daughter's miraculous improvement, and then made his announcement. He said that Ezekiel would now have complete authority over Catherine, her health, her movements, her life. That his daughter had placed her trust in a man who had succeeded where every doctor had failed. The room went still. Some guests shifted in disbelief. Others stared at Catherine, who sat silent and serene, the perfect picture of obedience. "I trust my father's judgment," she said, and then she smiled. Just enough to make the women at the table look away. The plan took shape in whispers. Catherine knew where the ledger was hidden, behind the wall in the cellar where the brethren performed their rituals. When Silas left for Charleston in mid-May, they would retrieve it. On the night of May 14th, they crept down the back stairs carrying a lantern with its flame shuttered low. The air below was thick and wet. The wooden table in the center was stained black, its grooves carved deep by years of use. Candles lined the walls. Robes hung from hooks. The place smelled of damp earth and something older. Catherine pressed her hand against a stone in the wall, and with a soft click, a hidden door opened. Inside was a smaller room, a sanctum. On a pedestal in the center sat the ledger. 2 feet tall, bound in dark leather, its pages swollen with age, Ezekiel opened it and began to read. There were names, dates, descriptions written in precise measured script. The brethren had been performing their ceremonies for over 40 years. Every 6 weeks, like clockwork. The sacrifices varied. Sometimes animals, sometimes people who would not be missed. Enslaved men, indentured workers, vagabonds, children. The book recorded it all, and in one entry dated October 1838, Ezekiel found what he'd come for. Purchased family unit from Virginia. Woman Sarah, children Benjamin and Ruth, separated from male to demonstrate resolve, sent to Alabama contact. Payment received, 3 lines. That was all his family's destruction was worth. He wanted to burn the book right there, but Catherine stopped him. "If it disappears, they'll know," she said. "We need proof. We need time." They were still copying when the sound of footsteps reached them. Light flared at the bottom of the stairs. Silas Rutledge stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men. Behind him, more shadows waited. "I must say," he said quietly, "I'm impressed. I didn't think you'd find the chamber." Catherine stared at him. "You were supposed to be in Charleston." He smiled. I came back early. I never trusted your recovery." They were taken upstairs and locked in the study. Catherine, ever cunning, managed to hide the copied pages beneath her gown. "He didn't search me," she whispered. "He's too sure of himself." An hour later they heard voices in the hall. The brethren were gathering. They were led back into the cellar, now transformed. 13 men sat in a perfect circle. Robes of black and crimson, candles burning in every niche. Silas stood at the head. "My brothers," he said, "my daughter and her companion have seen too much, but perhaps their discovery can serve a purpose. Tonight we test the limits of loyalty." He turned to Ezekiel. "You want revenge?" he said. "You want justice? I can give it to you. Join us. Not as an equal, never that, but as an associate. Help us maintain the order of the world and I will give you what you desire most. The power to destroy the man in Alabama who killed your family." Ezekiel said nothing. Silas continued, his voice smooth as oil. "Refuse and both of you die tonight. Accept and Catherine leaves here free. With money, with a new name, you will live. You will have purpose." Catherine shook her head fiercely. "Don't," she whispered. "Whatever happens, don't become them." Ezekiel met her eyes, then turned to Silas. "I'll join you," he said slowly, "if she goes free." And so the deal was made. Catherine was sent away the next morning. A carriage rolled down the drive, the curtains drawn tight. Silas believed he had won. But Ezekiel knew better. For 3 weeks Ezekiel played his part. Silent, submissive, watching, waiting. He studied every man who came and went. He learned their habits, their weaknesses. And when the night of his initiation arrived, he was ready. June 3, 1841. Midnight. They led him into the cellar once more. The brethren stood in their circle. On the table lay a young woman, an enslaved girl, bound and gagged, trembling. Silas handed him a knife. "To join us," he said, "you must begin the ritual. You must make the first cut." Ezekiel looked down at the girl, then at the men around him, then at the blade. He took it, and when he moved, he did not move toward the girl. He turned and with a single strike drove the knife into the throat of the man standing closest to him. The candles flickered. Blood sprayed. For a heartbeat, no one understood what was happening. Then the room exploded into chaos. Ezekiel tore the robe from the falling body, threw it across the candles, and plunged the room into half-darkness. He fought like a man possessed, fueled by years of rage. These men, who believed themselves untouchable, had never faced someone with nothing left to lose. He cut the girl loose. "Run," he shouted. "Run now." She did. Upstairs, Catherine heard the screams. She had never gone to Philadelphia. She'd been hiding nearby, gathering people from the neighboring plantations, men and women who had lost loved ones to the brethren's rituals, who'd seen friends vanish into the swamp and never return. 23 came, armed with hammers, scythes, axes, and rage older than memory. When the enslaved stormed the cellar, the brethren tried to fight. Some begged, some fled, none survived. Silas, bleeding and desperate, seized Catherine and pressed a blade to her throat. "Stop!" he roared. "Or she dies." Catherine looked him in the eye. "Do it," she said softly. "You've already lost." She drove her elbow into his ribs, twisted free, and turned to face him. Ezekiel stepped forward. "You took everything from me," he said. "My family, my life, for what?" "To prove you could, please," Silas whispered. But mercy had no place left in that room. And when it was over, the master of Cypress Grove lay still at the feet of the man he'd once owned. Catherine and Ezekiel stood in the aftermath, surrounded by silence and smoke.
"What now?"
Ezekiel asked. "Now we burn it," Catherine said. "All of it." They poured oil through the cellar. They stacked wood. They carried the ledger to the table where so many had died. Ezekiel tore out the pages bearing his family's names and tucked them against his heart. "For them," he said quietly. Then Catherine lit the fire. They stood outside as the flames consumed everything. The walls, the roof, the lies. The fire rose so high it painted the dawn red. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked when it was done. "I'll go north," Ezekiel said. "Find others. Help people escape. Make sure this never happens again." "And I'll go north too," she said. "I've stolen enough of my father's money to disappear. But I'll write it all down. Every name, every sin. I'll hide it somewhere safe. Someday someone will find it." They turned and walked away, one west, one north, and never saw each other again. The official story said that a fire had started in the cellar during a late-night meeting. 13 men died, a tragedy. The county mourned its finest. Catherine Rutledge, the poor mad daughter, was said to have perished as well. No one questioned it. The enslaved were sold off to new masters, scattered like ashes. The land was rebuilt, the past paved over. But stories have a way of surviving. In whispers and songs, in quiet moments when truth refuses to stay buried. People spoke of a night when the masters burned. Of a woman who remembered. Of a man who fought. Years later, soldiers found bones in the swamp and strange markings carved into trees, but the war swept on, and the past went quiet again. Then in 1971, a construction crew found a sealed journal in a wall. It was written in code. They said it contained names, dates, rituals. Before anyone could study it, the book vanished. Some said it was destroyed. Others said descendants of the brethren took it. A few believe it still waits somewhere hidden, patient, waiting for light. And so the story of Cypress Grove remains half buried. What we know for certain is that 13 men died in fire, that Catherine's body was never found, that Ezekiel Cross vanished into history. But in the quarters and the woods and along the hidden roads of the South, people told another story, about a network that helped others escape, led by a man who once brought a house of horrors to ash.